Good morning. I'm actually recording this in the morning for once, so I hope everyone is doing well. I'd like to continue talking about ancient Sumerian society today, but I'd like to begin by just making a few announcements about upcoming assignments. First of all of you should have received a grade for the first quiz, and that should be available to you on the grades function of As You Learn. Some of you took it online, some of you took it in person. It was the same quiz, so be sure to check it. Some of you did not take it. I did reach out to every person who did not take it, and so at this point, those who've not taken it, that will not count for you. But please, I know that we're in difficult circumstances with this being a hybrid class, but it is important to follow the lectures, to do the readings, and do the assignments. So if you are ever not clear about an assignment, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to set up a Zoom meeting with you or speak to you on the phone. I'm more than happy to help, but please do keep up to date with the assignments. Let me just mention assignments that are coming up. First of all, you will be reading, you've started reading for today, and you will continue to read for Friday and Wednesday, the Epic of Gilgamesh. I have made two versions of that available. You are welcome to read what I call the easier version or the more modern version, but I ask that you also take a look at the sort of more conventional translation as well, even if you're mainly focusing on the modern text. Remember, those links are available and As You Learn. Remember that we do not have class on Monday. No one has class on Monday, so the Monday group will not meet next week. And then finally, do remember that I am holding an optional synchronous Zoom session on Friday. So if you want to attend the optional Zoom session, you are welcome to. I've placed the link on As You Learn. Those of you who do not attend the Friday class will be expected to do the lecture and the related assignment. Let me just finally mention that your assignment connected to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Ancient Sumerians is a one-page, single-space paper. The prompt has been placed on As You Learn. And let me say a word or two about this. This short paper is the concluding assignment for this unit. It will be due by the end of the day next Wednesday. I don't have the date off the top of my head, but I believe it's September 8th. And you will submit this online. Everyone will do it. And let me say, and it will be an analysis of the cultural work that we're looking at, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So let me just read the assignment or the prompt to you. For this paper, you will have a background question and a main question. Your goal is to answer the main question. The subject matter of the paper should be what I'm calling the main question. But I would also say that as you answer the main question, try to kind of slip in thoughts about the background question as well. Focus on the main question, but include some reflection on the background question. The background question is a more general question. How does a text help us to understand the society that produced it? And how does understanding a society help us to understand the text? What I'm asking you to think about, in other words, is what is the relationship in terms of our understanding of the ancient Sumerians between the text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the material that I'm giving you in lecture about Sumerian society? How does the literary work from this past society help us to understand these ancient people and their way of life? And in turn, how does their way of life and what we know about this ancient people help enrich our understanding of the text from that time that we're reading? I'd like you to think about the relationship between both sides of that question. The main question, the actual topic of the paper, is this: how does the Epic of Gilgamesh help us to understand Sumerian ideas about death, the meaning of life, sex, or gender relations. And how does understanding Sumerian society help us to understand what the Epic of Gilgamesh says about death, the meaning of life, sex, or gender relations? As you can see, this question is closely related to the former. It's just more specific. I want to be clear that you are to focus on one of those themes, i.e. death, the meaning of life, sex, or gender relations. You are not to do all of them. You won't have space to do that in a one-page single-space paper. Focus on one of them. Please focus on one of them. So your paper should be one page, single space. Be sure to address at least 2 tablets. Remember the Gilgamesh text is divided into what are effectively chapters, but that we call tablets. Be sure to address at least 2. I would say aim to have 1 or 2 short quotes to illustrate your point. Don't use the text, to be blunt, just for filler. Don't use it just to lengthen your paper. The quotes should be analyzed. The quotes should be evidence for points that you're making about the text, and you should use the quotes from the text to explain what you think you've learned about the society through the text. So explain to me how the material that you are presenting supports the arguments or the points that you are making. You do not have to have citation. Just give the page number, and if you're using one of the web sources that doesn't have a page number, don't worry about it. And please submit the paper as a Word document or PDF. I realize that you are using some applications that I might not have. In that case, I do ask that when you submit it, you use an online tool to turn it into a PDF. So it's due Wednesday, September 11th, by the end of the. I think I need to change the date there. I apologize. It is due a week today, a week Wednesday. Okay, thank you. I'm going to pause for a second and go back to my. I think I got cut off there. I said I'm going to pause and go back to my slides, and I'd like to resume what I was talking about last time. So last time I briefly introduced the next unit that we're going to be talking about. I made the distinction between Paleolithic and Neolithic societies. Paleolithic are hunter-gatherer societies. That's what the Lascaux people were. Neolithic societies are societies that go through this massive transformation in human life known as the Neolithic Revolution. That consists of the changes to human life and society that occurs with the invention of farming and animal domestication. Put very briefly, the Mesopotamian society of the Sumerians is an early Neolithic civilization. I also introduced the terms Mesopotamia and the Sumerians. Mesopotamia is the place, specifically the land between the 2 rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, located in the Middle East and the country that currently is known as Iraq. The Sumerians were inhabitants, very early inhabitants of that place, and it's their society that we are going to be considering over the next few days. So the Sumerians arrived in Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE, in other words, about 6,000 years ago. We know little about their origin. We do know the language they spoke because they wrote it and we can read it. They encoded it and we can decode it, and I'll be talking about that. They settled in particular in southern Mesopotamia and founded a series of independent city-states that I'll be speaking more about shortly. And it is worth knowing that at a certain point in their history, Mesopotamia was inhabited by non-Sumerian peoples as well, who sort of blended in with the Sumerians, whom we simply call a Semitic population. And this population we know more about because it's connected to contemporary Hebrews or historical Hebrews and Arab people. So those are just a few basic points. What I'd like to do now is to begin to define a key term that I'd like us to think a bit about today, which is civilization. And I'm not necessarily using this term, or I hope that I'm not using this term in a judgmental way, but more in an analytical way of referring to a particular type of human society. And I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Civilization refers to a type of society. It's more specific, you could say, than the term society itself. There are societies that are not civilizations. The hunter-gatherer societies of the Paleolithic period being the obvious example. So what do we mean by civilization? Let me explain. In the third millennium before the Common Era, meaning roughly 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians inhabiting Mesopotamia began to form city-states. They're called city-states because they are cities. In other words, they are densely inhabited areas of permanent settlement. And they're called states because they are politically independent. Okay, they are not part of what we call a territorial state. They are not one city in a larger land that is sort of centrally ruled. They are cities that are politically independent. So, in other words, what's happened is Neolithic settlements, Neolithic farming settlements, have become larger, more organized, and more permanent. Some of the key cities of ancient Sumeria, and these come up in the epic, are Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Kish. And what I would emphasize is that the very term civilization, which is a Latin term, comes from the Latin word civilis, meaning a townsman. And here we can start to sort of tease out some of the specific meaning of the term civilization. First and foremost, a civilization is a society consisting of towns and cities and the people who live in them. Okay, once you have cities, you can have civilization in the proper sense of the term. The hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic period did not live in cities. That's the reason why we say that they were not a civilization. So what I would like to sort of have us think about for a bit, before I say more specific things about the Sumerians, is what the economic basis of a civilization is. And I guess what I mean by that is, how does the organization of the means used to satisfy basic human needs have to be set up, have to exist for a civilization to exist? The key thing to remember is that is what a city is and what a townsperson is. And that might sound like a kind of vague question, but there's actually a fairly specific answer to it. First of all, and I would say first and foremost, a city is a form of social organization that consists of non-farmers. Okay, we think about this when we talk about a town as simple or as familiar to us as Boone. Okay, in Boone, you've got the courthouse, you've got the university, you've got the restaurants and stores, and whatever farming there is takes place outside of it. Decades or centuries ago, a place like Boone was the location of the market that farmers brought their goods to in order to sell them. So at a basic level, cities consist of a non-farming population. But even non-farmers need to eat. Even non-farmers need basic supplies that not only allow them to eat, but also provide them with the resources they need to build homes and so on. And so what this implicitly means is that the non-city inhabitants are getting those basic resources from somewhere. And if they're getting those basic resources from somewhere, that means that someone is producing more than their own personal needs. In short, what a city implies, almost by necessity, is the existence of what we call an agricultural surplus. For a city to exist, you need farmers, and you need farmers producing more than their own needs as farmers. To use a technical term, you need a situation that is not based on subsistence farming. Subsistence farming is when you farm to produce only the needs that you as the farmer have. Once you have a situation in which farmers can produce more than for their own needs, you have a surplus. That's what a surplus means. And the surplus can be used to support people who are not farmers, i.e. a city population. So in other words, the sheer fact that the Sumerians have cities indicates that we're not only dealing with a farming society, but a farming that has an agricultural surplus. And I would argue that an agricultural surplus, for the reasons I've laid out, is the basis of civilization, is the sort of, to use a philosophical term, the condition of possibility of a civilization. It's what makes a civilization possible. A few sort of quick comments on Sumerian cities and their relationship to farming. As I mentioned, Mesopotamia is a sort of geographically and meteorologically forbidding environment, meaning that the land is difficult and the weather's very hot. But the presence of the rivers makes life possible. First of all, and second of all, with the presence of rivers, you can divert the water of those rivers to land that is not necessarily located along the shore, and use that water for farming. In other words, you can have irrigation canals. Irrigation is a engineering system for diverting water from places that have it to those that don't, and it can be used also to store water during time periods when there's insufficient rainfall or availability of water. We know that the Sumerians had advanced irrigation canals. That was an important part of their society, as well as their political organization. They also had dikes that could be used to sort of hold up water in the rivers, and as a storage system, and a water storage system because of seasonal variations in river flow. And if you want to get an approximate idea of what this might look like, the picture that I'm showing you right there is farmland in contemporary Iraq. I'm not saying that the Sumerians would have looked exactly like that, but that gives you an idea of the kind of farming that can take place in Mesopotamia if you are clever about the way that you use the scarce water resources. So what I want us to think about, and what I think is an important and interesting question, is what are the consequences of an agricultural surplus? Think about this for a moment. If you have an agricultural surplus, I guess I am saying, first of all, you can have cities, right? Because the agricultural surplus, that, in other words, the farm goods that are over and above the needs of the actual farmers themselves, can be used to support other populations, hence a city population. What are some other consequences? What are some other ways in which the organization of human life can change because of an agricultural surplus? Think about that for a moment. Sort of run through your head some possibilities of what becomes, what sort of opportunities open up because of an agricultural surplus. All right, I hope that you've had a chance to think of a few possible examples. Let me run a few by you. The first, and I'm going to organize the next part of this lecture in terms of a series of consequences, and I might not get through all of them today. The first consequence, I would say, is, and this goes almost hand in hand with the idea of a city itself, is what I would call simply the development of a complex social structure. Let me explain. Farming and the increased availability of foodstuffs and other materials that farming makes possible allows the population to expand. This is another major reason why the Neolithic Revolution is so important. It leads to an expansion of human populations that was not possible with hunting and gathering societies. Something else that it makes possible is the division of labor. And I would say, again, almost of necessity, the moment that you have cities, you are dealing with the division of labor. It means that at least part of the population is farming and part of the population is doing something else as their main sort of activity. But I would also say that cities imply further examples and complications, if you will, of the division of labor. It basically means not all of the community's labor has to be dedicated to farming, freeing some to pursue other work. The division of labor is almost a synonym with the next point, which is specialization. Okay, if you once you have an agricultural surplus, there is the possibility for certain people to specialize in certain types of activities, certain types of work. So some of the population, and indeed most of the population, will continue to be farmers. It's important to understand that in most civilizations, most of the population is still farming. It's only at a very, very late stage in Europe, sometime in really the last 150 years or so, that the percentage of the population that is dedicated to farming starts to fall below 50% and much lower. At this time, most of the population is still farming, but not all of it. First of all, you'll have people like, another specialization besides farming is craftsmen. In other words, people who are manufacturing goods and whose specialty is manufacturing goods rather than farming. This might be tools and equipment that is needed for farming itself. It might be other forms of labor. One type of craftsman that you'll certainly have, for example, are various types of construction workers. You need a certain type of labor to build irrigation canals or to build the kind of buildings that one finds in the cities. You also will have merchants. In other words, people whose job it is to trade goods and at a certain point to buy and sell goods. We know that at a certain point, Sumerian merchants traded with the north for wood and stone to build. Why? Because wood and stone, as we've seen, are not in abundance in Mesopotamia. And then you also get a different kind of specialization with the emergence of religious functions in society and the development of political leadership. In other words, people whose job it is to run the society, whose work is leading or dominating other people. And we'll see that religion and political leadership are often connected. And because of specialization, or at least in part because of specialization, you see the emergence of social hierarchies. You see a kind of ranking of society according to the relative value of different people. This might make us uncomfortable, but it does seem to be almost inseparable from the emergence of civilization itself. The way that I like to put it is, in a hunter-gatherer society, little hunter-gatherer talks to his or her parents, and the parents say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And well, you're going to be a hunter-gatherer. There's not really any other option. That's what one does. I guess you could sort of be a shaman if you go with the Lewis Williams sort of interpretation of the cave paintings, but I suspect even the shaman, puts in his fair share of hunting and gathering too. In the Little Sumerian, on the other hand, I seriously doubt that they had a great deal of choice, but it at least is a kind of theoretical possibility that there are, because of it, to imagine them asking what they want to be when they grow up, because there are different trades, there are different specializations that one can have. So this is something that is sort of the first consequence of an agricultural surplus. What's another consequence of an agricultural surplus? The second one that I would point out, and this might sound surprising, is the development of religion. And I should be careful here. I don't want to sort of suggest that this is kind of, that there's a sort of billiard ball-like connection, that if you have an agricultural surplus, that sort of immediately sets into motion a chain of events that results in religion, or to suggest that there's no religion previously. As we've seen, the various theories of cave art suggest that that hunter-gatherer populations had notions of the sacred, had notions of a spirit world that existed beyond the sort of normal world, and so on. I guess what I mean more specifically, perhaps, is religion as an organized social structure. I don't really like this term too much, but it, as we sometimes say in everyday speech, I guess I'm talking about organized religion. So let me explain how this works. Sumerian societies were in particular, where we can see this in very concrete terms and not just in an abstract way, is that Sumerian cities were physically organized around large religious buildings, specifically a type of building. You could call it, if you want, a sort of Sumerian pyramid called ziggurats. These were mountain-like structures. You can see the great ziggurat of Ur in contemporary Iraq in my picture right here. Remember that there's no stone or little stone in Mesopotamia, so you have to make them with the available materials, which in this case are clay bricks. You take clay from the shores of the Tigris or the Euphrates, you shape it into brick, you let the brick dry in the sun, and then you take a lot of those and you make your ziggurat from it. So, one way to define what a city-state in ancient Sumeria is that it's a place built around a ziggurat or something like that. So the ziggurats are interesting because they're religious, but they also have an economic function. They are basically, I'm exaggerating a bit, a big pantry. Okay, they are granaries where one houses surplus, the agricultural surplus. Specifically things like the wheat and barley that would be farmed in the surrounding fields. In some cases, they're also workshops. So there's this kind of sort of combined function of them being religious, but also being places of work and places of storage. So this is, again, it's not sort of a kind of direct connection per se, but this shows the way in which a certain type of religious organization is kind of intimately connected to an agricultural surplus. The same building where you worship your gods is also the building where you store, literally, your surplus. A few other comments about religion. The towns themselves were first led by a caste of priests. The first leaders of the city-states are also, you could say, kind of religious mediators with the gods. And I will be talking more about Sumerian religious beliefs shortly. One scholar describes the city-states as divine households, meaning the Sumerians seem to have seen them as divine households. In other words, what it means to work in this society is to work for the gods, and the foremen, if you will, the supervisors, if you will, of this divine work were the priests who were also the political leaders. There's evidence that suggests this was how leadership was understood at this time. So I would also then sort of say that religious and political leadership oversaw farming, irrigation, and the surplus. And so those are the sort of main characteristics, if you will, of political leadership at this time. And if you want a sort of image of what these priests might have looked like, the sort of clay statue that you see right here seems to be an ancient Sumerian sort of figurine, and it seems to represent a priest. So you may have noticed that I actually had to step away and interrupted my lecture there for a moment, but I'd like to return to my final point for today, continuing with this idea of thinking about the consequences of agricultural surpluses. After the first two, in other words, complex society and the development of religion, I'd like us to just conclude today by considering a third. And the third is what I would call the development of kingship, and more broadly, the existence of a state. And what I mean by the state is something like the institution in society that is specifically charged with political leadership, and in some cases, the conduct of war. And I would just sort of say that if one thinks back again by way of comparison to hunter-gatherer societies, no doubt one found in those hunter-gatherer tribes certain individuals who were regarded as having authority, power, whether it be sort of involved in leading the hunt or involved in semi-religious activities like shamanism. But one probably did not have, or at least there's no evidence of, the existence of a kind of institution, of a way in which power is organized, made permanent, sort of woven into the basic characteristics of this particular society. That changes with Neolithic societies, and we can see this with the Sumerians. I already mentioned the fact that we start to see the emergence of something kind of like political authority with the role that the priests of the ziggurats assumed. But at a certain point in the development of these Sumerian city-states, we also find the existence, or the emergence rather, of political leaders, i.e. kings, as a very well-defined role that is common to these societies. So it's a different form of specialization around political power and political authority. How did this emerge? Well, Sumerian city-states frequently were at war, or at least in conflict with one another. And as I indicated, there is sort of little evidence of war as an organized activity in hunter-gatherer societies, whereas one does find it in these societies. To be simplistic, you could say that once societies have developed an abundance or surplus of resources, whether it be an agricultural surplus such as a cache of wheat or grain, or other goods such as jewels, or certain forms of artwork that have great value to them, or just craft goods in general. War is an activity that you could say has a premium on it, or has a kind of purpose. So there is tension between these towns, partly because of the sort of specialized labor and the goods that produce that you had in them. And in this context, the towns found it useful and necessary to appoint a particular individual as a sort of protector, as a kind of city governor, who eventually became thought of as a king. And if you want a kind of conception of what, or an image of what a king might have looked like, again, I'll sort of refer you to some Sumerian artwork. In this case, one that is actually carved from stone rather than a clay figure. The image that you see to the right is the king of the Sumerian city-state of Lagash. This is from around 4,000 years ago. The kings were frequently thought of as being of divine origin, and I think it's interesting that these kings were often seen or thought of in sort of farming terms. It's interesting when one thinks of political authority or of how we think about politics more generally, that we frequently will use metaphorical language to talk about the function or the purpose of a leader. In this case, that of the Sumerians, there was a tradition of thinking about kings as Ishaku. Ishaku is a Sumerian word that means tenant farmer. So in other words, the king was God's tenant farmer, or to flesh that out, what that means is God was the ultimate landowner, the ultimate proprietor, but he would appoint a single individual, a single human whose job it was to supervise the work that went on God's territories. Something like that is what the notion of God's tenant farmer meant. A few other comments about kingship and the state in ancient Sumerian society. The kings were closely identified with local gods, and I think it's interesting to note that in addition to gods that are tied with particular natural functions, and I promise you again that I will have a lecture in the next few days where I talk in more depth about Sumerian religious beliefs, but in addition to gods associated with particular natural processes or functions, there are also local gods, community gods. So each town would have its own god, and the king was strongly associated with them. How does a king in these times have power? I think this is always an interesting question for people who think about human society to ask. What makes power possible? What is the basis of power? What are the tools and resources one must have in order to have power? And I think it's always worth keeping in mind that those tools and resources might vary according to society and time period. To return to my major point, a crucial factor or a crucial resource that kings had that secured their power was their ability to control the agricultural surplus itself. The surplus really is the basis of political authority, just as it's what causes these other features that I've talked about as well. At a basic level, a king is someone who collects taxes. That's not an exhaustive definition of a king, but it's a pretty good definition of a king at the same time. And what would taxes be in this society but agricultural surplus or things that derive from it? So at a basic level, a source of king's power is his, and it usually was a him, ability to receive a kind of cut in the goods that those who live under his protection produce. I could point out that there are certain political theorists who sort of have the idea that the very development of the state itself is actually not much more than a kind of organized crime-like protection racket. I'm not saying I subscribe to that theory, but maybe when we look at kingship at its very origins, we understand why some people might think that. Kings typically got also a sort of nice slice, if you will, of land that was available that they could then farm or have farmed for their own purposes. Kings, as I mentioned, were importantly involved in war, in military activity, in conflict with other city-states. When one fights a war, it is also an economic activity because war engenders booty. And what booty is in the basic economic sense of the term is goods that one plunders from one's enemies. So another source of royal or kingly wealth is goods that one plunders in battle, that one takes from other people as a result of having conquered them. And all of these resources can then kind of reinforce one's power. One uses power to get these resources. Once one has those resources, one can use them to solidify one's power. A wise and thoughtful king, or at least a cunning one, might use wealth, the various wealth achieved in these ways, to spend on temples, irrigation canals, and other things that might benefit the community in ways that also sort of solidify the king's power. So what we're really talking about in all this is the emergence of what sociologists sometimes call the idea of a state. And I guess the basic way I would define a state is political authority insofar as it is separate from any particular individual who happens to exercise it. You know, the town of Ur might have one king replaced by another, replaced by a third, but what the sort of continuous functions exercised by all three of them are what we might call the state, the kind of continuity of political authority and the various functions that it assumes in that society. And I would just finally sort of point out that in thinking about Sumerian ideas of kingship, you might look at the picture here. This is actually technically not from the Sumerians. It's from a later population that immediately comes after the Sumerians, called the Akkadians, but they are connected to the Sumerians, let's say, and living in exactly the same place in southern Mesopotamia. This is a famous stone artwork called the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin was a king, and this gives you at least a kind of taste of what slightly earlier Sumerian societies might have been like. You have the powerful warlord king towards the top of the Victory Stone, holding some kind of spear, and below him you have his soldiers who have just completed the battle. One of them seems to be sort of blowing into a kind of trumpet in victory. And then above the king, you've got two heavenly bodies. You've got actually two suns that seem to represent the gods. So the king is sort of presented as not only a warrior, but as someone who is kind of located between the common people, the soldiers, and gods that are associated with heavenly bodies and thus natural forces. So that gives you some ideas of what kingship meant in this society. I'm going to conclude here. Remember that on Friday you have the option either to do a synchronous Zoom session or to do the Friday recorded lecture. Please remember that you also have to do reading. I believe that it's tablets 5 to 8, but it's whatever I say on As You Learn. We don't have class on Monday, and on Wednesday I will see the Wednesday group and not the Monday group, but there will be a recorded lecture, and you have the paper due that I talked about at the beginning by the end of the day on Wednesday, September 9th. Thanks, everyone, and I will either be talking to you more on Friday or seeing you via Zoom. Take care. Have a good afternoon.